Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. Will we be among the blessed who will eat bread in the kingdom of God, that is, in heaven? Jesus' parable in today's gospel gives us some instruction on how to be among those called to eat the supper of the Lamb. The parable begins with a man, clearly a very rich man, who held a large banquet. St. Cyril notes that this man represents God the Father, the one who is the source of all goodness, and the one who calls us to eternal happiness in heaven. This man sends out his servant, just as God the Father sends Jesus into the world. After all, as Philippians chapter 2 verse 7 says, Christ emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. The servant's role is to invite people to the banquet, just as Christ came to call all of us to heaven. Now, the first group of people whom the servant goes to are those who are already invited to the banquet. Naturally, these are probably family and friends. In other words, those people who are already close to the man holding the banquet. Unfortunately, however, each of these people politely refuses to go to the banquet, giving excuses like examining a newly purchased field or oxen, or having just been married. On one level, as St. Cyril notes, these represent the Jews who had received the invitation to the banquet through the prophets, and whom Christ first called to the heavenly banquet. Many of the Jews, especially those who are most educated and in places of religious authority, rejected Christ's invitation. On another level, however, these people represent us each time we are distracted by worldly things. We may already be familiar with God and may be aware of our invitation to heaven. However, as the new land, the 5 yoke of oxen, and the new wife symbolize, we are often caught up in our possessions, in our work, or in our earthly relationships. Now, none of these things are bad in themselves, but when they distract us from the greatest good, the heavenly banquet, then they become problematic. Saint Gregory the Great also notes that these people are very polite and pretend to be quite humble when they decline the invitation. Please have me excused, they say. Similarly, we often do not reject God outright. We try to very politely decline God's call. We rationalize our distractions, making excuses as to why they are also important. In doing so, we pretend that avoiding God's call is justifiable. However, as the parable shows, rejecting God's call can have eternal consequences. If we choose not to accept the invitation, God will give us exactly what we have chosen and allow us to be eternally separated from Him. Now, in contrast to this first group, 2 groups actually do attend the festival banquet. The second group is described as poor, crippled, blind, and lame. Unlike the first group, they do not seem to already be close to the man who is putting on the banquet. These people do not have money, and they cannot rely on themselves because of physical illness or deformity. Thus, they freely and joyfully receive the rich man's generosity. The third group is not given a description except that they are somewhere in the highways and the hedges. The servant is told to compel them to come in. St. Gregory the Great notes that these represent those people who are far away from God, who are wandering along various highways, or who have completely lost the way and are stuck in the hedges on the side of the road. Even these sinners are called by God, who sent His Son to compel them to come in. Jesus' lesson to us in this parable is straightforward. If we want to enjoy the eternal wedding feast in heaven, that banquet to which we are all invited by Christ, then we must not be like the first group. We cannot rely on our past familiarity with God, but we must ever strive to become closer and closer to Him. We must not be distracted by our earthly possessions, our work, our human relationships, allowing them to come between us and God. Rather, we must see that what we have and that what we are is of no worth without God. Like the poor, the blind, the crippled, and the lame, we cannot rely on ourselves. We must rely entirely on God. Moreover, we must become aware of our sin, our inability to live holy lives by our own power. It is precisely when we realize our sinfulness and turn to God's call that He gives us the grace that will compel us to join Him in the heavenly banquet.